Hi, good morning. It's great to have you all here. I'm wondering if we can actually get some slides up here as well, so we'll wait for this to happen. Let's take a little bit of a poll to see who we have here today. So how many of you are already a sort of tech lead or lead developer? Maybe architect or something like this? Do we have any engineering managers in the house? Engineering managers or sort of development managers? What about engineers who would like to be a lead developer or tech lead at some point? Okay, so we have a good breadth and mix. So this talk is very much about helping people who are looking to play this role as a tech lead or to step into a leadership role if you're sort of an engineer. And it's about talking with tech leads. So I've talked to many, many different tech leads over my life, and I've also coached and trained a lot of people in this sort of field. I'm currently working for a company called N26, which we're on a mission to be the first bank you'll love. We're based in Germany, and you don't often hear the word bank and love in the same sentence. And we're on a mission to actually change that. We're trying to really change how people experience banking services, particularly in Europe where it's a little bit more traditional and a little bit old-fashioned. Everything's on your mobile phone. I'm currently playing the role of a chief scientist there. I'm the former CTO. If you want to talk to me about that in the break or over Twitter, feel free to ping me. And I've published a number of books, and one of them will be this book about talking with tech leads, where I also mentioned that I run a sort of training course around this. So this is something that you can go online if you'd like to look at the syllabus. And for those who are interested in sort of keeping up to date with topics in technology, I also run a newsletter called Level Up, which is aimed about leadership, technology, and things around organization and processes as well. But today we're going to go on a bit of a journey, and today's journey is we're going to look at what is this archetypical story about how do people find themselves in this role as a lead developer or tech lead, right? So if you're a developer and you're thinking about this, how do you end up in this place? If you've been on this journey, you probably can recognize some of this. We're really bad at naming things in our industry, right? So we'll also look at a definition of what I describe as a tech lead, because it will differ across companies, and even sometimes in the same company, the responsibilities will be a bit different. And then I want to sort of focus on some of the surprises and struggles, right? So these are some of the challenges that you might face. If you've been playing this role, you'll probably recognize some of these challenges. Maybe you'll still come across some of them. And then finally, we'll close off with a few tips and tools around what I think you need to be a really great tech lead. So hopefully some practical tips that you can come away with as well. And along the way, we'll look at some lessons learned that we'll highlight with a star. But let's first take a look at what is this archetypical story. What is the journey of an engineer as they make their way into being a technical leader? So like any developer, hopefully you start off actually writing code, right? So most tech leads should start off be writing a developer writing code. And as a developer, you're looking for more and more challenges, right? So as you build systems, as you learn technologies, you often want maybe a bigger challenge, a more complex system, something with bigger scope, something that you've never done before. And this is often a way that a lot of people keep increasing their scope, and that's why they look towards technical leadership, because you think about what you might be able to achieve if you're actually leading an entire team, rather than what you yourself could possibly do. And so when people are going on this journey, there's two typical paths of how things get there. So one is typically, I want to be promoted, right? So I want this greater challenge. In many other circumstances, the second path is also other people in your business see you as somebody starting to lead or somebody who has potential, right? So we're going to give you a growth opportunity by putting you into this new role as a tech lead or lead developer. These are typically the two paths. But what's interesting is a lot of people think about this role as a sort of next step up on this career ladder, right? So I'm growing, I have a promotion, that means I'm entitled to more things. And I'd like you to first really get rid of that idea, right? We'll come back to that about why. So let's say you've now magically been promoted, you have this label, this title, which is giving you this role of a tech lead, lead developer. As an engineer, you go back to your computer, right? You go back to your table, and what do? Right? What's the things that change? You're probably wanting to write more code, you want to make more decisions, but nobody's typically walked you through the responsibilities and the differences of what you need to be successful in this role. And so you're normally resorting back to what you were doing before, and these are typically the things around writing a lot of the code, making a lot of the technical decisions, and perhaps you're starting to dominate some of the choices in your team. So lesson number one is recognizing that this tech lead role is not a promotion. It's a role change. And what does that mean? So let's go back to this career ladder. And one of the interesting things about startup land as you're sort of scaling up an organization is you have to put a little bit more structure in place, right? So one of the interesting things where I've been is that we've had to grow our organization quite rapidly. And one of the fun parts is actually establishing something like a career ladder. So I've done a lot of research around this. If you use these frameworks or career frameworks, you typically have this kind of idea of roles at different levels, and each level at a higher sort of rank has the implication of more impact. And typically there's the idea of what is expected. So these are your behaviors, and in which areas you are expected to have impact. So if you're using career ladders, there's some tips that I'd like to share with you as well. So firstly, it's not really a complete checklist, right? So nobody is ever comprehensive. Every situation's a little bit different. So you shouldn't treat everything as I'm doing all of these things, therefore I'm ready for a promotion. What it is, it's really a guide for a conversation, right? So this is to help you talk about expectations that the organization has with these roles, and it will be a little bit different depending on your context in your team, organization, or your company. And what I really love about it is that it removes a lot of systemic bias. So without anything actually written down, people who don't have any idea about what is expected with these roles, right? So if you're looking to be a tech lead or a lead developer, what does that mean in your organization? These things can give you guidance, not a complete checklist, but it can give you an idea about what they expect about that role, and it does differ from organization to organization. So let's go back to looking at this role of a sort of tech lead and where that fits. So in a lot of sort of career ladders, you start off maybe as a junior software engineer, where you need a lot of help breaking things down, right? So here's how you TDD things, here's how you put your build scripts in, here's all the things you have to do for definition of done. As you get more experience, you become a lot more independent. And so maybe you become a sort of software engineer where you can take things fairly independently and you don't need too much assistance. Over time, you're looking for greater impact. And so you might get sort of promoted to a senior software engineer because you're starting to lead perhaps a smaller subsystem or a microservice. Maybe you're starting to coach and mentor 1 or 2 engineers on your team as well, and you're starting to have a bit more impact than what you yourself are doing. Now, interesting, the next logical step a lot of people think about is this role of a tech lead being the next step up in this sort of cycle. And this is where I'd like to sort of talk about the 2-track model, which is often talked about in the US. So in the US, they often talk about 2 tracks of career promotion. In the US, they talk often about this idea of an individual contributor track. So you're an engineer writing code, or you're in the management track, right? So you're responsible for the system. I would actually argue that 2 isn't really enough, and I talk a lot about this thing about a trident model, so 3 tracks of career development. And this is something that I believe that all technical organizations should really be promoting, of making sure that there are enough growth opportunities for individual contributors and technical leaders, not just managers. But it's kind of interesting because if we go back to the simplification of this ladder, we often think, okay, this tech lead role is the step up in the same career track. But if we look at it through the lens of this 2 or 3 track model, where does it really sit? Is it really individual contribution, or is it something else? And here is where I would posit that being a tech lead, maybe by the name lead in the title, is actually about technical leadership more so than about your individual contribution. So what does this mean, and what do each of these tracks mean? It probably helps if you sort of use this sort of Pareto principle, right? 80-20. Where do you spend most of your time in each of these tracks? As an individual contributor, you're probably spending 70 to 80% of your time sort of doing or executing, right? So for engineers, this is typically thinking about design, right? Looking at how to break up a problem. It's often about testing, proving that what you've built is working quite well. And of course, there's the coding that you're actually producing individually as well. So you're spending a lot of your time at your computer. If you're an engineering manager or a sort of manager, I talk about managers being successful at managing the system in which people work. So not managing individuals, but managing the system. And what this means is it's often about supporting teams, right? So giving them maybe the information that they need, the context. It's making sure that the work that the team is working on connects into the bigger picture of the organization. And so often this means planning, coordination, communication. It's often about budgeting, and every manager will know terrible budgeting games that you might have to play about maybe headcount or training budgets and making sure that you connect into the wider organizational system. And it's often about organizing teams and structures well, right? So improving the flow of work, or changing the sort of skill composition to make sure your team is capable of completing all the things it needs to do. So this leaves the technical leadership track. What do they focus on? And this is where those people are spending about 70 to 80% of their time leading technical topics and teams, right? So what happens when you're building very complex distributed systems? Who's taking care of things like architecture, or that we're making decisions in a very consistent way, right? So a technical leader will spend a lot of their time doing things like aligning the team, right? Do people know which direction we're going? Are we trying to modularize our monolith, or are we trying to go distributed into microservices land? Are we going towards more event-based or reactive type architectures? Or are we staying with rest-to-rest, point-to-point communication? These are important technical topics that it's important people understand which direction a team or organization is heading, and it requires effort behind that. It's also often about technical risk management, right? So one of the complexities that you all know building software is that there's a lot of complexity underneath the surface, right? People who don't understand the tools or the trade-offs that we make can't easily assess the type of risk that we're actually accumulating. It's often about making sure that there is a technical vision as well, right? So give something that people want to contribute to, a greater mission, other than perhaps delivering value to end customers, but also something that excites people and engages people about the systems that they're building. A lot of it's often about tech debt management, right? So the good old adage around how much push do you sort of contribute to the product, but at what cost do you sort of take, and how do you pay back that technical debt at certain stages throughout life? Somebody needs to champion that and make sure that that is sort of managed over time. And a lot of the work is often about making sure that knowledge is spread across the team, right? So the trick about software is that it's constantly changing, everyone's constantly making decisions, and we're constantly losing touch with what's going on in the code base. And if we're not careful, then it's very easy to have lots of single points of failure in our team, and that means that we're not resilient to the team, and we start to work as a group of individuals rather than as a technical team. And so a good technical leader will be focusing on these sorts of efforts. And that's quite different from what you were doing before as an individual developer. So a top tip here is something that I've learned on leadership things, is this old saying about what got you here won't get you there. What this means is the skills and experiences you've built up as a developer often aren't automatically translatable to helping you lead technical topics and teams. So you need to start thinking about how do you make that shift. So this is the archetypical story about what this is. Let's dive a little bit deeper into what is this role of a tech lead. So we don't have great definitions, but here's a start. A tech lead is a software engineer responsible for leading a development team and responsible for the quality of the technical deliverables, right? So in a lot of organizations, you already have product people responsible for product direction, features, what's important, but somebody needs to take care of the internal quality of the software, right? How much sort of technical debt do we accumulate? How do we manage that? What tools and technologies do we actually choose? These are important things you need to take care of, and you need somebody who has that engineering background to be able to have those conversations appropriately. If you're looking at skills to develop, this is what I often describe as a well-rounded tech lead. So somebody who has good development skills, so people who understand the nature of building software, people who have good leadership skills, and people who have architecture skills as well. And so those two things are often undervalued in a lot of organizations, where often people will get supported with leadership skills, but they'll also not necessarily focus on architecture skills. But if you're doing this yourself and you're looking at wanting to play this role, lesson number 2 is this role requires great leadership skills, right? And so if you think about how many of the things that you've done personal development-wise, learning a new framework, learning a new testing approach, learning about microservices, continuous delivery, will not help you build great leadership skills. Anyone play games here, like RPGs? I used to play a lot of RPGs. I stopped because they consumed a lot of time. But you know, in a normal RPG, what you're used to is this thing about experience points, right? So you have time, and through your experiences, you can allocate these skill points to different specializations. And a great way of thinking about this is, as an engineer, you've probably been putting all your allocated points to sort of being a great developer, right? And this role is not being a great developer or even better developer. It's really about being a good, balanced technical leader. And so you've probably been allocating your points to areas where you haven't been touching, right? So you need to have a good understanding about system design, distribution, how to operate software as well. And you need really great leadership skills. You might have accumulated some experience perhaps through a sports club or something else, but you need to have a good balance of this, and often you'll be allocating your points to the wrong sort of area. And so one of the key lessons here is that you need to shift your focus and your own personal development if you really want to be an effective technical leader. All right, so next question, how to shift? Well, firstly, great that you're all here. First step is awareness, right? We can't do anything unless we know what we need to change. The second thing is then really making sure that you get some training. And the great thing about today's world is we have so many different platforms. We have O'Reilly, we have Udemy, we have all of these sort of learning platforms, resources available to us, online training, in-person training around this. And so that can help you get to a certain point. But if you've been on a training course, what often happens is you go back to your sort of day-to-day work and you get caught up in the everyday, right? And so what's also useful is you make sure that you get coaching. So people who've maybe been there before, you get feedback about what's going on so that you can actually get focus and practice some of this stuff. And that's really the fourth sort of lesson here, is that in order to develop any skill, and leadership skills are just like any other skill, you just have to find opportunity to practice. So like the way that you would do code katas to develop great skills at engineering, you have to think about what ways that you can turn these skills into actual practice and knowledge. And so a key takeaway I'd like you to really think about is if you want to be a great tech lead, start to shift your personal development away from just focusing on technical topics. Look broader at architecture, look broader at leadership skills, and you'll become a lot more effective as a technical leader. Now, one of the interesting challenges with this role of a tech lead is that you sort of straddle two boundaries. You straddle code and writing things, but you also straddle the team and leadership topics. And so one of the questions that a lot of people say when they're sort of in this role is, how much should I code, right? So what's the right level of coding? Now, we'll remember that developers don't spend 100% of their time coding. Hopefully, they're talking to other engineers, showcasing their work. So 100% is not realistic as well. But if you're doing sort of 80% of your time, like the same amount as an engineer, there's probably a whole bunch of things you're not taking care of. And so a rule of thumb that's kind of useful to think about is sort of about a minimum of 30% of time spent with the code. And my experience with a lot of tech leads is often not necessarily writing all the code, but you often spend a lot more time reviewing code, right? Giving feedback on pull requests, trying to understand how the code base is evolving to understand in which direction you might need to manage technical debt. But this is kind of good heuristic. Now, it doesn't really work from a week-to-week basis because there are times in a project where you might get pulled off into planning processes, right? So quarterly planning or yearly planning processes, which means you spend a week or two away from the team. But what that means is there's a whole bunch of things that have happened in the code base that you're probably missing out on, and you probably need to go back and actually review some more time. So that's saying that when you come back to the team, you probably need to spend a little bit more time catching up on what's been changing in the meantime. How do you be successful as a tech lead? What's a simple test? Here's a simple sort of rule that you can test yourself. So does the code base look like it was written by a single person, right? Like, it never really does. But what's kind of important here is you need to sort of squint to the code base. You need to look at the shapes of code. Can you open up a part of the code base and you know exactly which engineer wrote that? And then you open up another part of the code base and you know which engineer wrote that. That's telling you something about ineffective leadership. If you've got a sort of section of the sort of code base that is using long levels of an inheritance, and another part of the code base that's using functional style programming, right, that's telling you something about ineffective leadership, is that you have too many flavors of doing things. And so as you start to think about optimizing your code, what you're looking for is optimizing the team to act as if it was an individual. And this is a really good way of sort of seeing if people are actually acting like an individual sort of team. So there are a lot of different things that you can focus on with leadership. And the great thing is that there's a lot of different sort of areas around leadership that have been published upon. So each of these are a very big breakdown of specific skills, training courses, whole areas of knowledge that you can invest yourself in. And you'll probably want to take a picture of this one because these are often the books that I then recommend to people to go and read, right? So one of the great difficulties of working with highly opinionated problem solvers is obviously having to get to an agreement. So, one of my favorite books is called Getting to Yes, right? So how do you get to a point where you get agreement about a technical approach, right? How do you sort of influence product people to invest in technical debt? There's a book about influence on here as well, right? Storytelling, like the keynote talked about this morning, about how do you build that story up to be able to convince people why the technical debt is important to address right now versus in the future. Now, I love this quote: "Reading is still the main way that I both learn new things and test my understanding." Any guesses who this is from? This one's from Bill Gates. So somebody who's been in technology for a long time is still consuming a lot of information because there's always something to learn, always something to get better at, from leadership skills, architecture, or technologies. And so these are one of the really great things about today's age of the internet, where we have so much content out there. You just have to be willing to understand which areas you want to get better at, find that information, then find ways to turn that into knowledge and apply that, right? So lesson number 3 is recognizing that you can benefit from so many resources out there today, but be sure to practice, right? So I'm a big sucker of this as well. I read a whole book, and then maybe I put it to the side, and then I forgot about all the things that I have. And what I find is very successful is if you sort of go through a book and you take about 1, 2, or 3 different things, tips, something to change your behavior, something to develop a new habit. These are great ways that you can then translate that book into actual skill and practice. Right? So make sure you read widely, read things that you probably wouldn't have asked for before, talk to people in your organization about what to tap into, but make sure that you actually put it into practice. Okay. So we looked at the story, looked at what I mean by a tech lead. Let's look at some of these surprises and struggles. Now, one of the reasons I talk about these surprises and struggles is because when people are going on this journey, you yourself as an engineer know that this role is different if you've been playing this role for a while. And so nobody ever tells you, here's how you should prepare for these things or what to expect when you go into this new role. And often people get sort of traumatized by the experience and say, I never want to lead a team again, but I just want to go back to writing code. But the good thing is, if you know what is going to be a surprise and struggle, you can sort of mentally prepare yourself for it and create a better sort of support network as well. So we'll look at 3 specific surprises and struggles that pretty much every technical leader will have experienced or will experience at some point. So the first one is sort of depicted by this group of people and this sort of person in the corner. And this is the feeling of being alone, right? So as an engineer, you're often working with other engineers. You can complain to them exactly the same way. You can moan about a particular topic. But you can't really do that with your team if you're wanting to complain or moan about somebody on your team, because that's inappropriate, right? And so often you start to feel like you're sitting in 2 places. You're sort of part of the team, but then you're sort of on the outside, right? So the sense of feeling like an outsider all of a sudden. One of the common struggles that a lot of people have is this idea of like, I was really good mates with all of my friends as engineers, and now if I'm actually leading them, I have this weird different relationship with them. And this is just partly because of the different role, right? So you have a responsibility that you treat everyone appropriately, not just the people you are best mates with, but making sure that everyone has a sort of fair voice in the team. Another consequence of this role and why you feel this way is that it's a natural part of being a sort of information shield and filter. So some team members will want to know everything about what's going on in the organization. And other team members don't really care. They just want to be focused on what they want to do. And what's really fascinating is that you never get this right, and it's never ever perfect, right? You're trying to always work out, depending on this person, what information and context is useful for you. But of course, you often end up with more information in a certain perspective than other people in your team, and that makes you feel a little bit different. So it's very natural to feel alone when you're part of this role, but you need to think about how you actually cope with some of these feelings. The second surprise and struggle is sort of depicted by all these arrows, and these arrows are sort of the idea about uncertainty, right? A lot of uncertain things. And one of the struggles that we have as engineers is we like to problem solve, and we like to come up with the solution, the most optimal solution. And one of the hard things about leading people, teams, organizations, is that there is often no right answer. There is often a good answer for now, but it's no perfect answer, right? And one of the challenges of this is that we're sort of trained as engineers with this binary habit, right? This test goes red, and I know my solution is working because it goes green, right? I deploy my system and it's working, or suddenly I'm getting all these alerts saying it's not working, right? So we're very much trained in this sort of binary way of thinking. And one of the challenges when we step into this role of leading is that you don't know if you make the right sort of decision right now. Maybe it's okay for now, and as the situation changes, as you get more information, maybe you wished you'd chosen a different thing. And so you always have to deal with a certain level of uncertainty, and that's really hard. That's one of the challenges of leading any organization, but particularly hard for people who've been used to a very strong set of certainty. And one of the other challenges is we're just dealing with imperfect information all the time, right? So our industry is constantly changing, product people are hypothesizing about what they believe is right. We're not really sure about what's actually going on. We also only get certain amounts of information, and it takes time to collect that information. So you can't believe in the true economic model of saying we make perfect decisions if we have all the right information, because in reality, it takes time to get that information and to sort out what's important signals versus not. And so you'll always have this dilemma of, have I made the right choice? But get rid of that idea. There is no right choice. There's what you believe is a good choice for now, given the information you have and the situation at hand. And as the situation changes and as you get new information, maybe you then need to change and adapt as well. And that's an important part of being an effective leader. The third surprise and struggle that a lot of tech leads face is sort of depicted with this snowflake, so sort of appropriate as we head into winter. And this is really that people are puzzling, right? So the snowflake here is that everyone is unique. Every single person here has different preferences, different strengths. And I really love the different strengths thing as well. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But I think one of the interesting things that I've learned as a leader is to see people not through my own ideas and values, but to appreciate what everyone can bring to the team for themselves. And that may be very different from what I value in myself. And so you have to be very comfortable with working with people and leading people who are often maybe better at you in certain areas. Maybe you're stronger than them in other areas as well, but you need to recognize how these different strengths are. What's a really useful way of thinking about as you work with people is sort of cataloging patterns of behavior. But one of the dangers of cataloging behaviors is that you start to stereotype. So I often emphasize archetypes, not stereotypes. So archetypes help you give an idea about maybe the types of people that you might interact with, right? So you have things where people are a little bit more introverted, quieter, they need time to digest. You have maybe extroverted people who will constantly react, tell their opinion immediately, and need that sort of engagement. You'll start to learn words that describe people, and you want to sort of understand that. But just because somebody is maybe recognizing as this pattern doesn't mean you can predict how they're actually going to behave as well, right? So stereotyping means you apply your perception of what's happened in the past, predicting their behaviors, but archetyping can help you at least empathize with who you're dealing with, but never ever try to guess what people are going to do or say, because you'll always be surprised. I'm constantly surprised. So people are unique, appreciate them for what they are and what they bring to the team. So lesson number 4 here is taking comfort that others have really been on this tech lead journey as well. So even though we feel alone, one of the great things is that there are other people who've been on this journey as well. Reach out to those people. Build your own support network of tech leads or lead developers. If you have a bigger company, there's often people in peer teams that you can reach out to. If you're in a smaller company, reach out to people in another company, right? So it's important that you talk to people about people who've been on there before. Ask for advice. Ask for how they would actually deal with things. And once again, there is no perfect solution. They're just ideas and starting points that you might choose to have. Your team will be different because they're composed of different people, and you can have sort of different reactions as well. So top tip to deal with all of these surprises and struggles is really focusing on your own support structure. Build this network, right? So don't use your partner, your sort of, to talk about these topics. Maybe you have a manager that you can relate to, but find peers outside of your organization that you can talk to about these situations. A, they'll better understand the situation that you're in, and B, they'll probably have a different style of approaching problems than you. Doesn't mean that they're right or wrong, but it gives you starting points for ideas about how to tackle certain situations. So we've looked at some surprises and struggles. Let's talk about some tips that I can give you to be a really effective tech lead. So one of the first things is, as an engineer, we got into programming because we loved creating stuff, right? We loved developing things. And one of the biggest shifts that you need to start moving towards if you want to be an effective technical leader is that your role is no longer about developing code, but it's really about developing others so they can write better code as well, right? So that's the value that you add now. It's not about the things that you personally produce, but how much better quality code and better quality systems that you can produce as a team, and you're responsible for that environment. Now, a lot of the ways that we sort of start approaching this is, okay, well, we think about how do we develop other people? Well, for some people, we often go back to this idea of maybe telling people what to do, right? Completely valid in a certain situation, or we completely delegate. But what's this telling you? This is once again a two-option thing, and the world is a lot more complex than binary sort of habits. So we can actually expand this a little bit further, and we can talk about a model called the situation leadership model. So in certain situations, we should adopt different styles of leading appropriate to the person and the situation at hand, right? So if we're dealing with somebody who is maybe fresh from university, right? Lots of enthusiasm, lots of energy, but they don't have a lot of the experience. Having a more directive style of leadership is completely fine. All right, here's how you start writing unit tests. Here is the definition of done. We have to put code here. We have to write documentation here. We have to do deployment scripts. These are all the step-by-step things. Then that's completely fine for people who don't have that experience. But of course, people are smart and they learn. So over time, they don't want to be told what to do because they'll just get frustrated. It's like, I've already learned that. You don't need to tell me that again. So we need to be a lot more refined in our sort of model. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, if you know somebody is really capable of doing something and highly motivated, of course you can simply delegate. But by delegating something too complex too early, you can often give people too much anxiety, right? Too much stress that they're going to be not able to think properly, that they're going to be overwhelmed, and when they fail, they're going to be really traumatized from that experience and never wanting to do that again, right? So delegating something too early, too big can often be the wrong thing to do as well. And so we can take a little bit more of a broader spectrum. But one of the important things about situation leadership model is really starting to make sure that you grow people from being directive to the point that you can actually delegate things, right? So this is your mindset of really starting to develop other people. Am I constantly still telling everyone what to do? Or fast forward 3, 6 months, 12 months, have I got to the point where I'm actually being less directive and actually people know how to take care of things with the right level of quality? Can I successfully delegate more and more things over time? Because this is the true test of any leader. If you can grow other people so that they can accomplish more, and that means you can also focus on bigger topics and other interesting things as well. Now, in the meantime, we talked about the spectrum. What are other modes of leadership? Well, one of them might be you might need to sell an opportunity. I see this very common with maybe senior engineers who, you know that they're very good at doing something. You can trust them with the quality, but often the question is, but why do I have to do that? Why is it important, right? And so this is where maybe the storytelling aspect is quite important to maybe help people connect what they're doing to purpose, to how does it help the company, how does it help the client, what problem is it solving? You don't need to tell them how to do something. You need to make sure that they are sold on the opportunity, that they understand how they are having impact, how they are accomplishing something much stronger, right? So this is an important leadership mode that you might need to take. Perhaps somebody is a little bit anxious about a new opportunity, and maybe you need to sell them the opportunity that this is a really great opportunity where they can grow and learn, and you can still support them by checking in quite frequently, but you might need to take this mode of leadership as you grow people to be able to delegate. Now, another mode of leadership is participation, right? Participatory leadership. And so some problems are so complex that you just can't delegate. You can't sort of know how to approach this, is that you might actually need to sit down with people and actually check in with them on how to break things up. And this is where you're working with people on a problem and you're contributing all of your skills, experience, and strengths and perspectives to actually understand how to break that up. This is one of my favorite styles as I'm starting to learn how to lead with people as well. So a new team is often I'll sort of pair with individual people. And as I get to understand where their strengths are, where their experience are, I can slowly step back. So I might need to participate very early on as I get more confidence with them. But then I can move to a point where I'm delegating more and more things because I understand their background, they trust me, and we have the same good understanding. So make sure that you're starting to really think about how you grow and develop other people along the spectrum, and make sure you use the spectrum of different types of leadership style. Now, as I said before, it doesn't really depend on the person. It really depends on their skill and experience in the situation, right? So if I was being taught or asked to develop a machine learning system, which is not my background, I would want somebody to give me this step-by-step, here is where I have to go, download this thing, click on these things, type the script in, and I would want the direction, right? Because it's not something that I have the skill and experience in. I need the direction. But over time, we'll learn and grow, and so we'll get to a point where we can delegate. So when you're thinking about which style to approach, think about 3 different areas. Think about their skill, think about their motivation, think about the urgency. Production outage, site down, right? It's not the time that you'd be going, oh, what do you think we should be doing? Maybe this is actually quite an important directive style where it's like, who's taking care of this incident? Who's on it? What's the current update, right? Making sure that somebody is acknowledging this. But of course, if that's your everyday life, not everything should be urgent all the time, otherwise you're probably not leading so effectively. Think about how engaged people are. I often talk about you need to give people often a little bit more of a challenge than what they're used to help them keep growing. Right? So the motivation, they may not be intrinsically motivated if they're feeling in a safe place, but you might need to keep pushing people to make sure that they're continuing to grow as well. A key leadership lesson that I learned early on was really tapping into diverse approaches. And I go back to the idea about strengths. And one of my favorite books around this is called the Strengths Finder book. Has anyone done this book? Oh, a few. So it's written by some people from the Gallup organization, and it's really fascinating because what they did was ask the question, what makes people successful at whatever they're doing in any organization? And so Gallup does really wide-scale research across organizations, across types of roles. And what they ended up cataloging was about 34 different signature strengths. And they talked about people who were really successful tended to focus a lot more on their strengths and applying their strengths in the context of what they were doing. Right? Because if you focus on your weaknesses, then it's like really hard, I get like incremental gains, and it's like a real tough work. But actually with strengths, you often end up with this reinforcing effect, right? So because it's a strength, it feels easier, it feels more natural. Often the results are a lot stronger, and so you kind of end up having a lot more sort of success in that, and you kind of keep doubling down on that. So this is why Strengths Finder is actually a really good thing. And because you have 34 signature strengths, when you do the book, there's a sort of online survey, and they say, here is what we believe your top 5 strengths are. But what that means is you have a whole bunch of 29 different strengths, which are not your top strengths. But the good thing is, we don't work alone, so we can actually work in teams. And this is why teamwork is really effective. Is that by tapping into more diverse approaches, you don't have to have that strength, as long as somebody else on your team might benefit from that strength as well. So let's talk about some concrete strengths they talk about. So one of them is achiever. And a lot of people in startup land has this achiever strength. I actually have this strength, and one of the things that you'll notice with achievers is that they're relentless list makers, and I like to cross things off my list, right? I need a sense of progress, a sense of achievement. And there are people who don't have that. But if you don't have people who don't have the strength of achievement, you might have a lot of talking and not a lot of things getting done, right? But at the same time, you don't want a team just of achievers, because you also want people to work on the right things for the right purpose as well. So you don't want a lot of activity unless it's actually contributing to a broader goal as well. One of my other sort of favorite strengths from the book, I don't have this one, is something called woo. So winning others over. And you might know people like this. There's apparently only 1% of the population who have this strength, and they're the people that can go into a room and suddenly they're best friends with people, or they can convince people of things with a really great idea, right? So winning others over, the sort of storytelling or the charm. And if you have somebody like this on your team, very useful if you're trying to influence maybe other teams or your managers to invest in a technical topic, because you can help get them to win them over with a particular idea, right? There's another strength which is actually very useful in software, which is analytical, right? So people who want to look at a problem from many different perspectives and understand the implications of that. If you're working with highly distributed systems that are very complex, having analytical people is really good, because you might understand where are the risks involved, the complexities of sort of second order sort of effects when you're sort of adding or changing a sort of system. So if you don't have analytical people and you just have achievers, you might end up with a lot of unwanted complexity, because you don't have people thinking through the consequences of the design of the system as you're evolving that as well. Now, another one of my favorites is one called harmony. And so some people on a team, you might notice these people is that as soon as something happens in the team, they're the people that sort of try to bridge the sort of conflict or to try to bring people back into harmony. My sister actually has this harmony strength, and you sort of notice it in our family. She's the sort of person who always brings our family back together after sort of heated discussions. So this is really useful for team building, building a really strong spirit. If you have this as a leader, that's really effective as well. What's really key here is recognizing that your strengths are going to be an interesting mix of the things that make you up, and that's why we're all unique. That we all have different strengths. We might share one or two of the similar sort of strengths, but what that means is that you need to understand that other people have different ways of approaching things. I remember very early on, one of the challenging situations I had to work in as a developer was pair programming with somebody. And I was really frustrated because I was the achiever. I just wanted to get started with like TDD. I wanted to write that test that failed. But the other person I was working with, I believe, was analytical, right? And they didn't want to start writing the tests. They wanted to talk to people and understand what else needed to be done as part of this sort of story, what else is like needed, how could it actually affect the system, and we had this sort of tension. Now, through StrengthsFinder, I started to realize it's not that they were right or I was wrong, or I was right, but actually we have different styles of working. And that's actually a really powerful thing to see when you're leading people, is that there's no one right way of working or approaching a problem, is that we have different preferences. And through something like StrengthsFinder, we could then agree, how would we like to work together? And so when I recognize when I'm working with somebody who is maybe not as achievement-based, then I'll make sure that they have enough time to do what they have, time-boxed. And so, I might actually start experimenting, spiking, getting a sense of progress while they're sort of analyzing, and then we can come back together and actually can work forward through that. And so one of the keys to understanding how you lead teams with lots of diversity is you have to understand how those diverse strengths are useful in different situations. And also, as a team, where your gaps are as well, right? So some teams will be maybe very achievement-based and some sort of strengths which are focused on getting things done. But there are some strengths that are a lot more about relationships and building relationships in. And so if your team is sort of biased towards one and the other, you might actually end up feeling more disconnected from your organization because you're lacking strengths. So it's really useful to understand what strengths you as individuals have, but also as a team to understand where your blind spots are. Now, I'm not the only person that sort of says that this is actually useful. BCG actually did some research, 2017, about how does diversity actually affect revenue? And they looked at 6 different elements, and they actually ended up saying that 4 of them were actually things that contributed to innovation revenue. So surprisingly, age and academic background were things that don't really affect revenue, right? So it's interesting. Companies that are trying to build new products, if they have more diversity in 4 of these elements, then they're a lot more stronger and more sort of innovative, and they can create new products as well. So go read the study, it's very interesting. One of the other tools that every leader struggles with is time management. And so make sure that you really invest time in the right things. One of my favorite tools for this is this table, and we'll go through this table. This thing is called the Eisenhower matrix. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of the different elements, but I want to talk about a couple of different things in here in particular. So one of them is about being able to delete things out of your calendar. There are things that are less important and less urgent. So these are your Slack interruptions, checking your email every 5 minutes, going to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of your social things that interrupt your flow. I know of some leaders that say, I only check my email twice a day, during this slot, during this slot. If it's urgent, somebody will probably come and find you, right? So it's not normally very urgent that you have to respond immediately. But the other quadrant that's really key to understand is this one over here, decide. So these are the things that are less urgent and important. And what's interesting about this quadrant is nobody will ever ask you to make time for this. They will ask you for the outcomes of these things, but nobody will ever ask a meeting for you to say, hey, what are your technical themes or priorities for the year? You need to understand what is important for your team because that is the act of leadership, right? And you have to decide to make time in your calendar to make sure that you decide what is most important for you. What's the most important thing for you today or your team today? The most important thing for your team this week, next month, or the year? And so you need to actually decide to make time for that because you can find that simply by responding to invites from other people, you're just going to get overwhelmed with lots of information, and you'll never find the time. And this is where a lot of first-time leaders really struggle, is that they feel they have to do all the important stuff out of hours. So a lot of tech leads that I know will often block out calendars, right? So this is my day for thinking about things, or afternoon. But make sure that you make time to focus on what is most important for you and for your team, because nobody will ever plan a meeting for you for that, right? You have to be responsible to do that yourself. If you want to sort of look further into this, this is called the Eisenhower matrix, and you can look into this very well written. So lesson 5 is really this mental model shift of moving from maker to multiplier mode. As an engineer, you're really attuned to being the person that creates things, the satisfaction of seeing the thing that you wrote have an impact. But your value as a tech lead is no longer about what you personally are writing, but actually the things that you can do to multiply your team. And it's really important that you're always constantly thinking about what are those things that allow you to have the most impact. It's not what you yourself will be doing, but really what you'll be doing to enable others on your team. So we've looked at this archetypical story about how people find themselves in this role. We've looked at the definition of what this role is. We've looked at the surprises and struggles and how to cope with some of them, and given you some tools so that you can be a lot more effective as a tech lead. To sort of summarize, I want to talk about these keys to growth. And the first one is really recognizing that this thing is not a promotion. Tech lead is a role change. And these require new skills, particularly leadership skills that you may not have actually invested in. Take comfort that others have been on this journey and build your support network. Reach out to people who've done this before. There are many people who've been there. And tap into the many resources out there available, right? So books, training, other types of topics out there. And most importantly, the hardest one is the mental model shift. And this is the thing in your head about how you recognize the value that you add. And this is really about moving from maker to multiplier mode. So you are no longer valued by the things that you do, but the things that you enable and the things that your team does, and being that multiplier effect. Thank you very much. We're out of time now. So if you have any questions, feel free to direct message me on Twitter. Otherwise, I'll be around in the break. Thank you very much.